just stop it. The run-of-the-mill, cheesy, humdrum bullshit status quo just tires me out. What fascinates me are the industry disruptors, the superhuman frontiersmen or women who go through hell to achieve their goals. Join me as we meet and learn from those mavericks, rebels, and business leaders that aren't afraid to piss off the establishment in order to make radical change for good. Sponsored by Johto PR, the disruptive anti-PR firm that murders your competition with cinder blocks and cyanide. This is Disruption Interruption. Welcome back, everybody, to Disruption Interruption. I'm your host, KJ, and we're here today to talk to another industry leader that has steered the reins off the lame, tired path of the status quo. Today's guest has been disrupting for over 2 decades as a neuroscientist. He's disrupting data solutions by supporting groundbreaking research in neuroscience and machine learning. We're going to find out what that's all about. His company's mission is to help research teams solve the most complex problems and bring clarity to big data and computations. Coming to us live from my hometown, Houston, Texas, please welcome the talented and brilliant Dimitri Yatsenko, CEO of DataJoint. Yay!
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy to discuss neuroscience and technology as it transforms.
Yes. So you didn't know you were in my hometown, did you?
No, I didn't.
Yes, you're in my hometown. So you are representing very well, Dimitri. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here in Houston, Texas, USA.
That's right. So before we get into this, because I know our audience is very interested in neuroscience. I mean, we don't hear enough about it, but it is, it's a disruptive industry in itself, right? But tell me, what is your number one main ingredient for disruptive innovation?
Yes, and neuroscience, of course, grows incrementally as all science. We build it on the shoulders of giants. And as neuroscience is moving toward much bigger data, much more complex experiments, the main thing that it needs is more of a systematic approach. So principle framework for research teams to coordinate their efforts on data-driven computational projects. So that systematic principle approach is what we bring to the picture.
Yeah, very systematic. Is that considered unusual for a scientist in itself, or is that part of the framework and built-in tradition of being a scientist?
Well, scientists are working with scientists in a collaboration. It's like herding cats. Everybody's trying to be a maverick, and that's great. Everybody's trying to do things differently, and in neuroscience in particular, because we don't yet know how to study the brain to the full capacity that it offers, that it possesses. So experiments are becoming much more complex, and it requires teams to work together for the first time. There's a lot of, historically, researchers have been a little bit more isolated. They work in the lab focusing, and now they're forced into, by just the complexity of the system that we're studying, into a much more collaborative, data-driven style of work. And that pushes them out of their comfort zones, and they're still used to working in a very haphazard or cottage industry type of, everybody's doing their different approach. So figuring out how to put it all together, how to put multi-lab, multi-institutional collaborations together is a difficult challenge.
Yeah, I was going to say it is a challenge. I mean, you just identified, I guess, the persona or the character of the neuroscientists and the scientists, right? They're in their ivory tower. They see something that other people don't see. They're out to figure it out and prove it. And now they're being forced into collaborating because of these complex experiments. So for our listeners, can you back up a little bit and tell me about some of these complex experiments that's happening in neuroscience?
I'll describe the roughly, and of course, this is a very rich, big history. Roughly, some of the trends say a few years ago, let's say in the 20th century, if you did electrophysiology, it was more about recording from a single cell at a time with an electrode. Then we moved to tetrodes that allow recording from a few neurons at a time. And now neuroscience in general has invested a lot into developing these neurotechnologies for recording massive amounts of data at the same time. So, for example, the BRAIN initiative, the White House BRAIN initiative that was started in 2013, has focused on investing very heavily into recording technologies. And so now we have, and that's not the only initiative. Many governments and funding agencies have focused on that. And so now we have technologies like array electrophysiology probes, for example, such as NeuroPixels is one that allows recording from hundreds of cells at the same time. And if you use several from thousands of cells at the same time, and not only individual modalities, now we're doing experiments where several types of recordings are combined in one experiment. So we can have functional imaging, electrophysiology, transcriptomics, complex behaviors, all in one experiment. So as before, so of course, these recordings are done typically in animals, in model animals such as mice. Mice are heroic animals for us that help us solve a lot of mysteries. So that would be done in anesthetized mouse that would be presented stimuli, and this is all very passive. So now experiments are moving to naturalistic behaviors where mice are performing complex tasks that are maybe something like hunting. They hunt crickets or collecting something, or just basically interacting with other mice. So and now all of these data have to be molecular data, genetic, then electrophysiology recordings, stimuli, all have to be combined together. And that requires, no one neuroscientist can do it. It requires a systematic approach with collecting data, but also modeling, so more a theoretical approach. So this now, as a neuroscientist, you will not get very far by proposing studies where you are by yourself recording from a single mouse.
Right.
Yeah, it requires these very multimodal, usually very collaborative projects.
So you have this multiple stimuli, massive data that you're having to collect, right? Organize, right?
Yeah.
And you mentioned something, and I might be paraphrasing, like hypothetical, postulates about this, like computation, so forth, right? You're trying to figure out, what are you trying to figure out?
Yes. So very often people, scientists focus more on treating disease. Fundamentally, a lot of neuroscientists, myself included, are more driven by figuring out how the brain just works, just baseline, what are the algorithms, what are the fundamental principles of neural circuits that make it so adaptive. So the brain is complex, and at the same time, it has some patterns to it. And neocortex, the outer portion of the mammalian brain, is very flexible. You can make the same circuits that look very similar in different parts of the neocortex, solve very different problems. Some are in perception, some are in planning, but fundamentally they look the same. So there must be some principles. So understanding those principles, it's just pure curiosity. But in terms of application, we can bring machine learning closer to how the brain works. So right now in machine learning, we call these algorithms in machine learning, we call them neural networks, but they have very, very little to do with how real neural networks. There are some similarities, but how the brain computes and how artificial neural network computes right now at this point is very, very different. And so we by understanding how the brain works, we can improve these technologies. But for many neuroscientists, fundamentally, they're just curious to figure out how we work, how our brains, how it is that genetic programs that build the circuits and the interaction with the environment together produce intelligence. It just seems like the most fundamental problem, the most difficult problem, and the most fundamental problem.
Yeah, and it's very interesting that you have this industry that is there to find out why and how it works, right? Do neuroscientists and other scientists, the data scientists that you work with, I mean, are they mostly curious about how it works, or do they have visions for application and they're going in that particular direction?
Well, so visions, it's different for different people, and I think more idealistic, more curiosity driven, perhaps focus more on just figuring this out. Of course, we also are practical in a lot of the things we can learn. First, help us if we understand how the baseline functionality of the brain, then we can better understand its deviations in brain disease and in mental illness. But so the clinical approach or the clinical applications of this in mice, we can reproduce a lot of the same ailments of the brain as in humans, sometimes with the same genes and sometimes with very similar symptoms. So the clinical side, from trying to mimic brain function in silico, in computing, that's where a lot of current investment is moving toward. Another application is better integration between technology and biology. So basically, better interfaces. So brain-machine interfaces is a big research area. That's where a lot of more sci-fi type of applications where you can put chips in the brain and interact more. That's again for us, where we focused was more to accelerate basic science. So more focused on fundamental understanding of how molecules, genes, and stimuli, how they interact to shape circuits to more on the circuit and systems level, how they shape the activity of the circuit to make it turn it into adaptive behavior.
Got it. And you said this particular area is where a lot of investment funds are moving into. Is that right? So there is investment on the commercial side. So more of companies or private investment that goes both into fundamental research, but also into applications, where the more of funding agencies, government funding agencies, the NIH, NSF, and DARPA, and others, they invest in applications and also a lot more on the clinical side, but also into fundamental research, just figuring out the principles of building circuits and neural activity. Right. So we have this proliferation of research going on in this particular industry. And you said there's just tons of data sets, right? And you said, typically they've worked alone. Now it's forced this collaboration. But what has that done with the data, that you have to bring such scientific rigor and clarity to being able to understand, organize the big data and the computations? Like, what's been the challenge and the status quo of that?
Well, so this is the intersection between science, technology, and social aspects of how science works. So as the data have become more complex and researchers have to adapt to it, the way they adapt to it is they just have to spend more time doing data software engineering, data systems engineering, and that typically falls on the shoulders of postdocs, graduate students, who now, as they work toward their PhDs, increasingly they spend more and more of their time and effort and knowledge on these engineering tasks, and that don't necessarily contribute to advancing their scientific career, or they prepare them for solving these types of problems, but they don't. They're not at the cutting edge of what they are contributing in terms of scientific findings.
They're not really doing what they went
That's right.
For so many years, right?
We have this phenomenon. People are fascinated by neuroscience, so they're willing to go and spend 6, 8, 10 years getting a PhD. But it's taken longer and longer. So that time to get a PhD has been growing. So now I think it's on the order of, I don't know the exact statistics, but it's well over 6 years. And
so the runway is increased. And is it because of this, they're handling these engineering hats rather than their actual science hat? Each
neuroscience lab is equivalent to a data-driven enterprise. In the industry, this would be a company with a team. But here, basically, graduate students with just their passion and expertise and passion and their just drive, they put together these solutions. They work. They perform this heroic task. But usually, these things fall apart as soon as they leave the lab and move on. And so there's not, and they're proud to produce these solutions. It's just over time, without a systematic approach across the field, there's little continuity, and there's a lot of inefficiency in that they reproduce the same problem, or they reproduce the same solutions across many labs. There's not
over and over from scratch.
Yeah, very often from scratch. And then once they graduate, they don't go get a professor position. They usually go and do a postdoc. So a postdoc is another period of training that sometimes you have to do 2 postdocs before you can land a job as an independent investigator. And that can take sometimes another 5, 6, 7, and sometimes 10 years. And so now from the time you graduate with your bachelor's degree to the time you can get a professorship position in neuroscience, it often takes well over 10 years. And
wow.
This is where you're considered that you are in training, but what actually happens is that you're working alongside with other researchers, working on these problems, contributing to the principal research of your lab. And a lot of, at this point, is the data. So a decade ago, 2 decades ago, the main problem was how to collect the data. But now we're collecting so much data. Increasingly, the bigger problem is what to do with it, how to handle it, and how much time we're spending analyzing it, figuring out just the data engineering, just the moving, the transforming of the data. Sometimes takes half of the time that the researcher spends on the project. So it's an extreme efficiency, and people don't see it because there's so much enthusiasm that students are willing to do this, and they're very and they spend this time of their career performing these acts of heroic effort.
Where does the frustration come in? I mean, there's this tsunami of data, right? And they're each in separate silos, creating their own systems and, gathering data, like almost recreating the wheel each time, right?
Yep.
Where's the frustration come in? Is there lost data? Obviously, is there?
So lack of continuity is one. So that's basically where it differs between many labs and institutions. But when a postdoc works on a project and after they leave, nobody can pick up what they started. And just in many cases, it's the case that when a grad student finishes their work, it cannot just continue into the next student's project. They have to rebuild things. So that having a more of a systematic framework for what's different in science from commercial approaches is that continuous fluidity. So we need to accommodate it. People always want to tweak and modify things, make them. So it seems like it would be incompatible with continuity. Like if you make things very adjustable and flexible and open, then it seems difficult to make it also last.
Right.
But if you define some principles, you can. And this is how we're aiming to change the field.
So tell me what you're doing there at DataJoint. So I have it, on a high level, but tell me how you started this, what you've been doing, how it's been helping, what have been your challenges?
Yeah.
Start.
It emerged from our research at Baylor College of Medicine. My lab mates and I together launched the company first to respond to a SBIR, Small Business Innovation Research solicitation from DARPA. And so we started the company. And it started from the developments that I began at Baylor College of Medicine during my graduate school years. So I went to grad school later. I had an ongoing career in software engineering, in engineering, systems engineering, medical imaging. And then I decided, I already participated in a lot of research. So I decided to go back and get a Ph.D. in neuroscience. And as part of this, I developed what I called then DataJoint. It wasn't the company, it was the data framework. For combining the principal innovation there is to work with data and computation in one unified framework. And this is something that from the scientific computer science principles, this is something that right now is not solved very well. We have great theoretical foundations for representing data, things like the relational data model. This gets technical a bit, but not in a unified way with how computation fits into that. So this is what the DataJoint framework solved, combining data and all the computational transformations across different stages of it. And so this, we made this an open source project. It's spread throughout other labs. And so by the time we launched the company in 2017, we had somewhat of a user base, and this was a time when a lot of research was funding went into collaborative multi-institutional projects, and a lot of researchers turned to us for our expertise in organizing a computational data pipeline that spans multiple labs. Not many people knew how to do that at the time, and so we picked up a few of these projects as customers. And so it went from there. And so
I love that. I love how you explain it so well. So it's like this pipeline, connection of data to these different labs. Was this done in tandem with, you said, the Baylor College of Medicine, or was it under the auspice of that? I mean, what was the relationship there?
So it started from the lab. Started in the lab. We developed these tools. When we founded the company, it was the four of us, four of my lab mates, including the principal investigator of the lab, Andres Tolias. And then they continued with their research. So I split my time between the lab, and one of the other co-founders also split his time between the lab and the company as we launched. And then as we build it up, I switched to full-time just in 2020 and was splitting my time. But the company is not formally affiliated with Baylor College of Medicine. It's fully independent and privately owned.
Got it. So you have these labs that are now a part of this data pipeline that you've been able to connect, right? Yeah. What have been the challenges for that? And then how is this pipeline helping get all this data together, make the computation? Tell me, and what do you see the future like?
Yeah,
great questions, right?
Yeah, so a lot of questions. So a lot of challenges. So challenges are pretty much they're very well defined by the nature of science. People try to do something different. Every team is trying to do something different. This is how you innovate, and that includes their approaches for data analysis. And so a major challenge is a lack of standardization or trying to figure out how to do things the same way. So we've been adopting to that rather than trying to fight that. We adopt it rather than prescribing a standard way of doing something. We accommodate, automating, and adapting quickly to a variety of approaches. So defining a more versatile framework that can quickly adapt to different approaches. And so this is what, when we work with researchers, say, yes, invent as many methods as you like. Let's try to organize them in such a way where we can automate that, make it cloud compatible, containerized, web accessible, so that it can be quickly deployed across multi-lab collaboration. So a lot of it is bridging that both social and technical gaps. Because if researchers are developing something just for themselves, it's often not very amenable to deploying on the scale of a multi-lab collaboration.
And multi-lab collaboration has a much higher chance of whatever going into fruition, being funded, using in applications and so forth. So it has a real world experience on this.
That's the only way we can solve the brain is but when you have to bring the molecular people, the computational people, electrophysiology people into solving the same problem.
All these mavericks together.
Yes. So,
you really are hurting cats.
That's right. No one person can do all of those things, or even one lab. So a lot of projects are increasingly very multi-lab.
With this multi-lab approach and this ability to really bring clarity to big data, has there been groundbreaking research that has happened, or is it on the horizon?
So it's an emergent type of phenomenon as you study. So what we're able to study now is more of how circuits, means populations of neurons, work together so I can provide a few examples. But,
yeah, please.
Right. So how on the population level, circuits respond and aggregate the data. One of the big projects from which where DataJoint was used in at Baylor College of Medicine was called Microns, Machine Intelligence from Cortical Networks. So machine intelligence from cortical networks, this Microns project, it combines the anatomy, microanatomy of the circuit, where with the function of the circuit in the live animal during perception of visual information. So in this experiment, a full cubic millimeter of tissue in one mouse was first fully imaged with calcium imaging, which allows you to measure the activity of neurons while the animal is behaving and waking. It's behaving awake, responding to stimuli. And in this, then the same volume, so every cell was characterized in terms of its responses to the stimuli. And then this volume was imaged with electron microscopy with 40 nanometer resolution to allow to see all the connections, physical connections, so relating that physical architecture of the circuit to the function of neurons. And then we can, how that's used is then we can train machine learning algorithms to reproduce the same type of activity and with similar connectivity patterns, and to bring closer bridge that gap between machine learning in silico and computers and the function of circuits in the living brain. So this is some of the... And
that is the ultimate goal, right? It's the prime ultimate goal.
Trying to reproduce the function of the brain in circuits a little bit closer. And so we see this tremendous progress in machine learning so over the past decade in particular, where machine learning algorithms are in many ways are performing better than humans in some visual tasks in recognizing, classifying. And so this is where we can bring some of the principles from the brain into computer science.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. And there has been a lot more attention on that just with different influencers in this particular space, or maybe not even in this space. I won't even mention. But how did you get into neuroscience? I mean, I know you said you were an engineer before, right?
Yeah.
But when was that epiphany, or what? Like you've always been curious by nature, right? Mm-hmm. So tell me that, and also tell me, when was the pivotal point where you said, "That's it, I've got to do something about all these disparate data sets"?
I don't know if there has been a pivotal point. It has been an incremental process. So I have always been in computing. So my first degrees were all in computing, computer science, engineering, things like signal analysis, imaging. I worked in the medical device industry, surgical navigation, surgical or imaging as well. I worked for a company called Ripple Neuro, where we built some neurology related devices and participated in the research there. And that's where my engineering, my medical device engineering experience overlapped with neuroscience, and that prompted me to go into basic science after that. But I don't even much earlier. Back in college in my undergrad, I took a biology course and we did human dissection and just holding a human brain in my hand. It was just amazing that all that comprises us, all our experiences, all our feelings, all our knowledge is really contained in this small volume, and somehow it all works. So
and you were hooked. You were hooked from that day forward.
It's definitely expanded just my sense of wonder, and so I did a lot of, I studied more physics and a little bit more for example, figuring out how better ways of recording from the brain. So that involves a little bit more physics and computation than physiology and anatomy. It focuses a bit more on the computational side of things, but with applications to neuroscience.
Yes. Wow. Well, where do you see, you obviously have projections or predictions on the industry and where things are going with neuroscience and, being able to connect the data for these labs. I now understand the name of your company, DataJoint. It's really good. Where do you see this changing things for our ability to really understand how the brain works and help us, in the next 5, 10, 15 years?
Yeah, so I think we're still quite hampered or a lot of teams are hampered by that, by their lack of, or just the difficulty connecting what they want to do logically, computationally with the infrastructure and organization that's required to do it. It's a lot of IT departments and they're not quite. It's difficult for them to adapt to this and to accommodate. There's a gap between just communications between the logic of computation, the logic of a data organization that's required for a neuroscience study, and then the IT computational infrastructure, and so there's that struggle, and there is a lot of overhead right now in research, so that's what we're overcoming. And I think so by providing a framework that first allows you to separate those concerns effectively and address them separately in a flexible way, that's what will ultimately address it. So you can formulate the problem and communicate it to the people who can execute it computationally on those scales, is something that we are bringing, and I think it's lacking in a lot of settings. So what we're seeing a lot is, for many projects, as they propose their research, just sometimes when you write a grant, you have to, in your budget, you have to specify the overhead, things that are not directly related to the research activities. And those things have also been growing. If you look at many institutions, it's a large fraction, sometimes between 40 and 150% of the
exponential. Wow.
Yeah, it depends on different groups. And universities are not always used to working with a commercial company that helps. So they're much more, and this is one of the problems we're helping overcome, is that if a company who does this professionally, systematically, can deliver it efficiently, then working with a university rather than building their own on-premise infrastructure that incurs a lot of overhead just because how it's used, to a more centralized cloud-based approach where things can be solved more efficiently, but they may not be used to that type of funding structure. And so that's something that we're overcoming. I think in the future, that extra flexibility and efficiency can accelerate research and make it more efficient.
Do you think there will be more demand from neuroscientists and data scientists and, all the other stakeholders to have that level of efficiency rather than the on-prem, sites, systems, so that you can get more research done? Because it seems like if the cost is so exorbitant and exponentially increasing, when are we going to get down to the brass tacks of how we're going to use this to better mankind, right?
Yeah, and this problem, we've been talking about neuroscience. This is not specific to neuroscience, and it has been solved. Neuroscience is perhaps a late
bloomer.
A late bloomer compared to other fields, for example, astronomy, particle physics, genomics. So all of these industries have gone through this transformation much earlier. Perhaps their data, they may disagree with this, but is much simpler compared to neuroscience. But also these large scale. So they've arrived at this more first standardization, common frameworks, and also involvement of commercial companies that can help execute things more effectively and provide computation as a service rather than having each lab reproduce the same computation with graduate students. But at the same time, it's an unsolved problem more generally than neuroscience. So definitely, we plan to expand into other fields as well. But in neuroscience, this need is the most acute because of the recent exponential growth of neurotechnologies for acquisition and data acquisition, complexity of the data, multimodal experiments, collaborative projects. So all of these very quickly, I would say over the past 10 years, have really become, made the problem a lot more acute in neuroscience. But these are general problems.
Yes, but not so general for the neuroscientists, right? In that field. Do you think it's become, these other, aspects of science or sectors of science? And you said, gosh forbid if we say it's not so complex, right? But they have made something that was complex and streamlined it and put their standards. Was that because, there were more applications being brought to market that this science could actually contribute to? And now we're into neuroscience, right, which is moving in that particular direction. And so this innovation is part and parcel of the puzzle to get there.
That's right. So I think they had maybe more time. So their technologies, say, if you take astronomy, the amount of data grew gradually. Or in particle physics, grew more gradually, and then it was driven by a lot of these mega projects that invested heavily into specifying frameworks, defining frameworks, providing computational solutions. In neuroscience, because of the much greater diversity of experiments, it's been less amenable to standardization. But at the same time, the technological growth has had a very rapid onset with the Obama Brain Initiative, 2013. The Brain Initiative that's still ongoing. The premise was, and it sounds good to the public, is that if we only can record from every neuron in the brain, if we can only record from hundreds or thousands of cells at the same time, all the neurons in a simpler brain, say in a zebrafish or something, it's a zebrafish embryo. If we can only record from every neuron in the brain, we would be able to figure out the principles of operations. That sounds great before you start, but now we're collecting this data. So what do you do with it? How do you analyze it? So now that some of those promises came to fruition, at the time it was easy to say, oh, if we will be able to figure this out. But now, so we've solved the problem. We're solving the problem of collecting massive amounts of data. We just don't know how to analyze it, how to fit it.
How do we analyze it? What do we do with it?
So even if I knew the timing of every spike in the brain of a fully behaving mouse or a human, I would still not necessarily be able to make sense out of it, or learning in new principles. We need frameworks, we need effective data tools, and that's next. So that wasn't, maybe people knew about this at the time when those proposals were made. They knew that would be coming, but they thought, okay, let's get there first. Let's collect the data first. And now we're collecting these data. How do we solve the problem of the brain that still remains?
Right, and that's your job. It's one thing to know about something. It's one thing to then know it.
Right.
Right. Yes. Dimitri, what do you do outside of do you have any crazy passions outside of this?
I've been hang gliding for 20 years.
Really?
And I lived in Utah, with beautiful mountains and stuff. So that's something. So that brings me, closer to the elements. And here in Texas, it's a little bit different, air towing. So there's go to an airfield, they tow you to 3,000 feet, you release, and then you catch thermals and fly to clouds and hop around.
How did you get into hang gliding?
So I started in Utah. Just one day I decided I would start doing it. You start on the bunny hill, take off, first run with a hang glider, gently picking you off. And then you get higher and higher on the slope. So that's how you learn there. Here you would learn differently in tandem. But
you learned in Utah. And how high do you go now? Utah.
The highest have been, here on typical flight, we would go to 4,000 or 5,000 feet. On these epic flights, you can get to 16. You're not supposed to get above 18,000 feet in the hang glider, but yeah, you need to bring supplemental oxygen and all of those things.
So you get up. So have you gotten up to 16,000 or what?
Yeah, in Utah I have, and then also in Europe over the Alps, got to. Yeah. So yes, it's beautiful.
Pretty cold up there.
Yes. So even when it's 100 degrees on the ground. So so I remember it was 30 degrees Celsius on the ground. Then you launch at the launch point, which is a ski resort on the top. It's a little cooler. And then once you get to 16,000 feet, I was wearing my ski gloves and everything was still cold.
Wow. Do you have a most memorable hang gliding experience that you can tell us about?
Just one beautiful flight from Switzerland to Italy, Fish, Switzerland, and when you see all the glaciers below you, that was a long time ago. I still every once in a while it still comes up in my dreams. That
sounds gorgeous. How do you land?
Oh yeah, you need to
very carefully
be aware of where you can land. So you always, within the 45-degree cone, you always need to know below yourself. You always need to have a spot where you think, if you're going cross country, usually you land where you take off, and you learn how to do the standard approach, downwind, base final, target where you land. It's kind of like that.
You actually land where you take off?
Yeah, usually the same airfield, the same spot. Yeah.
That's fascinating.
If that's where your car is, that's where
yeah, right?
Yeah.
That's it. But you're the first person I've heard that did hang gliding. That's
awesome. It's a great sport. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I never thought of it as a sport.
Yeah. But people think of it as a thrill. I think of it as more of a very peaceful. It's in the same category as sailing or something that's, where you're using the elements, you're using the wind to take you places.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's a wind pipeline.
That's right.
Dimitri, how do people get a hold of you?
You can contact, all the information is on datajoint.com, and our open source resources are on datajoint.org. We're on Twitter. DataJoint Neuro is the handle. These are some ways.
By the way, I love that you have it on open source. I love that you did that.
That's right. Everything is open source. Everything that touches the data is open source.
That's good. That's awesome. Thank you so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Thank you, Carla.
Yes. That's a wrap, everyone. If you learned something today, tell someone about this podcast and tell people to go disrupt their markets with a tidbit from this show. Thank you for listening to the Disruption Interruption podcast, where we transform lives, change consumer behavior, alter economics and science, and never accept the status quo. Ciao for now.
Because we live in a highly litigious society, with America being one of the top litigious countries in the world, here's our legal disclaimer. This information is not intended to be a substitute for professional public relations or legal advice. Do not disregard seeking professional legal, healthcare, or financial advice, or delay seeking professional PR or legal advice because of something you have heard here. Contact an attorney to obtain advice on any particular legal situation or problem. Use of this podcast or our website or any of its social media or email links do not create an agency-client relationship between Johto PR and the user.